Well, good evening to all of you. I'm Nancy Netzer, inaugural Robert L. and Judith T. Winston Director of the McMullen Museum and Professor of Art History here at Boston College. I extend a warm welcome to all of you to this evening's lecture in our Museum Current series. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Rachel Chamberlain, our Manager of Education, Outreach and Digital Resources, for organizing this series. Our speaker this evening is Richard Newman, Head of Scientific Research at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where he has been since 1986, and where I had the privilege of working with him shortly after he arrived. Before the MFA, he was a conservation scientist at the Harvard University Art Museums for 3 years. I'm pleased to say that in addition to his duties at the MFA, Professor Newman is now also a part-time faculty member in our art history department at Boston College. And this semester, he's teaching a seminar for students in our new Museum Studies track on the materials of art and their conservation. Richard Newman has a list of publications too long to recite here. And he has overseen a laboratory that analyzes close to 200 objects each year, most from the MFA collections. He also has long-standing projects with curators and conservators from other museums throughout the world, like the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and he has received numerous research grants to work on objects ranging from stone sculpture in India to paintings by Velázquez in Spain. Richard Newman will share some of his discoveries with us as he speaks about science in an art museum this evening. So please welcome Richard Newman to the podium.
Thank you all for coming tonight. This is about science in an art museum, but it's not particularly scientific because I don't think a lot of you are probably scientists. And I've arranged it around 3 stories. I wanted to begin with a very brief history of science in art museums. 2 slides worth of history. This gentleman named Friedrich Rathgen was the first chemist employed by a museum. He was hired in 1888 in the Royal Museums in Berlin. And he's often regarded as the father of science, the founder of science, focused on conservation and preservation of cultural heritage. In 1929, an Oxford-educated chemist named William Young came to the MFA in Boston to start a fledgling research lab, the first such lab in a major American museum. For many years prior to this, Edward Forbes at Harvard had been interested in technical examinations of paintings, and shortly after the Fogg Museum opened on Quincy Street in 1927, in their Quincy Street building in 1927, the chemist Rutherford Gittins was hired to begin a lab there about the same time that Young started at the MFA. And there's a little bit of a question about who had the first lab in the United States, so I'm not going to get into that. Just about the same time, and they knew each other, they worked together with each other over the years. And now, nearly 90 years later, there are 16 scientific research labs in American museums, heavily weighted, as you can see in this map, to the northeastern corridor. From the very beginning, science labs and museums have had 2 basic roles. First, that's in the left-hand yellow box, development and improvement of techniques and materials used in preservation of works of art, the study of how different materials deteriorate and how control of the environment can impact deterioration. The second role, the blue box on the right, involves the study of artist materials and techniques. And our lab at the MFA, which has 2 full-time staff, focuses on this type of study, materials of art. And I'll give 3 little stories involving materials of art this evening. And the three stories fall in these three categories. We don't have to spend any more time looking at that at the moment. My first story is an authentication one. For millennia, marble has been a major sculptural and building material throughout the world. This picture shows part of the modern Carrara quarries in western Italy, which first became an important source of marble in Imperial Roman times. My story involves a U-shaped piece of marble that's about 5 feet across, often called the Boston Throne, although calling it a three-sided relief is probably a little more accurate. Excavated in the environs of Rome in the late 1890s, it came into the MFA's collection at the beginning of the 20th century. There's one other clearly related object, and the two together may have been part of a 5th century BC altar. This is a little sketch of what perhaps it looked like in its original setting. The unusual nature of the object and its somewhat clumsily carved decorations have caused some scholars to question its authenticity from the very beginning of its time in Boston. Some consider it to be a much later Roman creation or even a 19th century forgery. From a scientific point of view, to absolutely determine its authenticity, we would need to determine when the relief was carved, but this can't be done by any kind of direct means. So at the most, we can build a circumstantial case by looking at the materials it was made from and how they were used. This is a map of some of the known ancient marble sources in Greece and Turkey. William Young carried out a study of the MFA sculpture, our three-sided relief, in 1968, just a few years before he retired. He concluded that the marble came from the northern Greek island of Thasos, which you can see at the very top in the middle there. His conclusion was mainly based on the fact that the marble that the sculpture is made out of consists of a mineral called dolomite, whereas virtually all other ancient marble sources in the Mediterranean basin consist of the mineral calcite, much more common one in marbles around the world. Since that time, the three major quarries on the island of Thasos have been extensively studied. In this geological map of Thasos, the violet and the light blue areas show the extensive marble deposits on the island. The major ancient quarries are indicated by the beige boxes. The only source of dolomitic marble on Thasos is Cape Vethae, and we're virtually certain that this quarry supplied the marble for our three-sided relief. Vethae is known to have been an important source of marble in ancient Greek and Roman periods, but is not much utilized in recent times and would not be an expected material in a 19th century forgery or sculpture of any kind for that matter. Just as an aside, the Vethae quarry is a few miles away from the Marble Beach, which is a very popular tourist destination on Thasos. The beach is filled with small rounded pebbles of marble, as you can see in the foreground of the picture. We can surmise something about the tools used to carve the sculpture from remaining marks on the surface of the marble. These include the use of a drill, as seen between the first two toes, the largest and the next toe over in this figure. Such drills were in use, we think, by the 5th or 6th century BC, so this might have been a relatively early use of such a drill. As excavated, the relief was covered with dark accretions in soil, as shown in this early pre-1900 photograph. Before coming to Boston, the carved surface was reportedly cleaned with razor blades, which removed most of the dirt and many of its thicker accretions, so it looks like a fairly white-colored piece of marble now. The inside of the U-shaped piece of stone, however, was only roughly finished at the quarry, and this is a view of the inside, and it was not cleaned. William Young had pioneered a type of examination that he felt provided proof of authenticity for ancient carved marble objects. This involved preparing a thin section from a chip of marble that included the weathered surface of the object. Thin sections are a standard type of sample used by geologists to study rocks. And at his time, he used an optical microscope to take this photograph. Authentic accretions developed from chemical alteration over a long period of time in a burial environment appear as a very fine-grained brown or reddish-brown layer well adhered to the underlying marble surface. Young concluded that the presence of such accretions on a sample from the uncleaned inner surface of our three-sided relief proved that the relief could not have been carved in recent times, although there were people that didn't believe his conclusion. In our most recent examination using an electron microscope, we observed a phenomenon in the weathering layer which is known to geologists as de-dolomitization. In this phenomenon, the dolomite mineral is slowly converted to calcium carbonate along mineral boundaries. This is not a phenomenon that can be duplicated successfully by forgers using any kind of accelerated aging, so as far as we know at the moment, although many have tried. And in this image from the electron microscope, the dark gray grains at the bottom are the dolomite substrate, and the white veins in between are where the calcium carbonate has replaced the dolomite. Although the carved front and side surfaces of the sculpture had been extensively cleaned, as I mentioned, with a razor blade probably, remnants of the same types of accretions occur on the carved surfaces. This is a close-up of one of the little brownish accretions. And during the past year, we made some cross-sections from very small bits of such accretions, and a sample was taken from the whitish area at the bottom of that accretion. I think you can see it's whiter than the surrounding marble. That's where we took our scalpel to take a few little chips. Some of these, such as the one pictured here, also show de-dolomitization. That's the narrow calcite veins extending into the dolomite grains of the marble itself. Further evidence that the three-sided relief is not a modern forgery were traces of the pigment Egyptian blue that we identified last year on the surface, probably remnants of polychromy that once may have covered most of its carved surfaces. It's now thought that many, perhaps most marble sculptures from the ancient world were once garishly painted and possibly gilded too, as in this recreation in the Acropolis Museum, complete with a visitor who looks sort of like she belongs to the earlier era. The verdict from our research is that the three-sided relief is an ancient sculpture, although we can't rule out the minority opinion that it's of Roman origin. Though we can almost certainly rule out it being a forgery that was made shortly before it was dug up purportedly in the environs of Rome. That's my first story. My second short story involves madder, the general name for many types of plants that have red roots from which dyes can be extracted. And you see one such plant here. And this is really what the roots look like at certain times of the year when you pick the plants. Historically, the major use of such extracts has been in dyeing textiles. And these are just some fibers dyed by a modern textile artist who uses madder still. Many types of madder grow throughout much of the world, as shown in this map. It shows different species and genera of plants that have supplied matter to different cultures in these different parts of the world. Not all of the plants contain exactly the same red-colored compounds, but there are a number of compounds that are common to many genera and species of these plants. This is a science lecture, so I have to put a little bit of science in, but you don't need to pay attention to this slide if you don't wish to. But this shows some of the chemical compounds that are responsible for the color in madder-type plants. They're called hydroxyanthraquinones. 5 of the most common ones are shown at the top, and some compounds called glycosides, in which a sugar or 2 sugar molecules are bonded to the parent molecule. They're shown at the bottom. Alizarin, the compound at the top left, was first artificially synthesized in the later 1800s, and a number of materials now made with madder are actually made with a synthetic alizarin. But you can still find madder made from the natural material. The red coats of the British Revolutionary era soldiers were dyed with madder. Later, after the Revolution, madder was replaced by an insect dye in Europe, cochineal, that the Spanish had discovered in South America, and which was a much brighter color than madder was. But I believe at the time of the Revolutionary War, they were still using madder. The red compounds can also be made into, whoops, did I go the wrong way? I showed you that one already, right? That's what happens when I press the wrong button. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, we don't need that one. The red compounds found in these roots can also be made into pigments, usually by extracting the roots in hot water. That's all it takes to get the red colors out, and then mixing the water extract with chemicals to cause the hydroxyanthraquinones to precipitate in complexes with aluminum or sometimes other metallic elements. Pigments formed in this way are usually called lakes. The crimson dress in this Vermeer painting contains a rich glaze of madder lake. Madder-based lake pigments are still available in artist paints, and you see one of them from Winsor & Newton at the top right. Rose madder is a common name for the lake pigment, and it's even been incorporated, as I recently found out, in the titles of some modern novels. And I'm trying to read that Stephen King one right now, but it's not one of his better ones, I don't think. Health benefits from madder root extracts have been claimed for at least 2,000 years, probably much longer than that. And Pliny certainly writes about madder and how it can help your health in various ways. You can still purchase tinctures of madder on the market, and I have a label from one of them here. If this happens to be important to you, this particular one is manufactured in the USA, as it says on the label, although the plants were grown in Pakistan. My lab at the MFA has been involved in a multi-year project to study the color that's used in Japanese colored woodblock prints. I think we've studied, my associate is mainly working on this, but I think we've studied 600 or 700 so far from our collection. We're trying to examine prints by all the major artists in the Golden Age period from 1600s, later 1600s, up to about 1850 when synthetic pigments were imported into Japan and they replaced the natural pigments that had been used earlier. But madder lake was certainly one of the several common red or pink pigments and is often found with safflower, which is another one of the common red colorants. And madder is one of the two different red pigments used in this particular Hiroshige print. Another project we've been working on involves mummy portraits from ancient Roman period Egypt. In ancient antiquity around the Mediterranean, both madder dyes and lake pigments were common. These could have originated from 3 or 4 different types of plants, and I'm showing the distribution of those here. In mummy portraits from Roman period Egypt, purple or pink fabrics are often painted with madder-containing pigments. A common feature of clothing was the clavus, a vertical strip of cloth, as you see on the gentleman on the right. These can often be pink in color, sometimes also violet. It's possible that the actual fabrics portrayed in these paintings were dyed with madder, just as the pigments in the painting were made with madder. Mummy portraits were fairly accurate representations of the mummified person's face. The paintings would have originally been placed on the head of the mummified body, although most such portraits are no longer associated with the wrapped mummies to which they were originally attached. Over 24 museums, including the MFA, are currently collaborating in the development of a database for mummy portraits, which includes art historical, archaeological, and technical information. I believe there are something like 2,000 known mummy portraits, and this database probably will have at least 1,000 of those images of them. They can be used by scholars to compare styles, and some workshops have already been determined, or some paintings have already been related to one another by scholars who've been able to see good quality images on the website, which is not publicly available at the moment, only available to members of this consortium, but it's heading towards the direction of being more readily available to everybody. And then my final story, which is the one a story I've worked on the longest, on and off for 20 years probably, involves another natural material. And this study was partly undertaken to shed some light on a long-standing archaeological question. Mopa, a term of obscure origin that apparently originated in the early 20th century, refers to a natural resin that comes from trees of the Eleasia genus, and some of these trees are shown growing in the mountains of Colombia here in this picture. These trees are found in the western slopes of the Andes, from all the way from the northern coast of Colombia down through Peru and into Bolivia. Natural resins are sticky exudates that are not soluble in water, and they've been used as adhesives in incenses and fragrances and in varnishes throughout the world by many cultures, because trees that generate resins grow almost everywhere. And our Christmas trees are one example of a type of tree that has a lot of resin that certainly doesn't dissolve in oil and water if you tried to wash off your hands after the resin dries on your hands around Christmas time. Traditional natural resin varnishes, often mixed with linseed oil, were very popular in the past for furniture, musical instruments, and carriages. Solutions of some natural resins were very popular paint varnishes, and some of these can still be purchased in art stores. These are some older bottles of different types of varnishes here. Most of the common natural resins are at least partially soluble in solvents such as turpentine or alcohol. Mopa is unusual in that it does not come out of the tree as a sap, and it has different chemical composition than most of the common tree resins. It appears on the plant as very small, hard balls, buds, as you see in the top image. These form on a stem, and they are broken apart as a pair of opposing leaves grow. Then a new bud forms between the new leaves, and the process continues. Mopa is completely insoluble in the common solvents that affect most natural resins. And little tiny resin balls are like about half a centimeter in diameter. If many of these little resin balls are put in nearly boiling water, they coalesce into a somewhat opaque caramel-colored mass that can be stretched into a very thin sheet or even into a string when hot. These are two conservators I worked with in the past in the early stages of the Mopa project, and they bought some of this resin from the market in Colombia, and then they're experimenting with it and seeing what you can do with it. After cooling, the sheets or the strings become harder and they're not very flexible, but if they're heated again over a period of months at least, in water particularly, the sheets become flexible once more. In Pasto, a town in southwestern Colombia near the border, the local craft tradition utilizing the resin has existed continuously for at least 400 years. The pigments are used to color the mopa resin. The mopa resin is heated in water. Pigments can be kneaded into the heated resin, a bowl of heated resin like kneading bread. Or possibly some dyes could be put in the water, and the water is heated and they would be taken up by the resin also in the water. So the colored resin is taken out of the water, stretched into sheets. The sheets are cut into little pieces, and these are then stored for future use. And when the craftsmen need them, they take the sheets out, they heat them again, they cut them into little pieces, and they press them in place on a piece of wood to form a decoration. No adhesive necessary, they're sticky enough. UNESCO recently recognized this long-standing craft tradition for protection in Colombia. Small, not very complicated mopa decorated items such as these can be purchased over the internet. And if you typed mopa on the internet, it would bring you to some of these workshops, these small workshops in Pasto, Colombia. And I like the iPhone one there at the bottom left. And one of my collaborators is a conservator in Colombia, and she sent me a couple of little items she purchased on the market, like a little calling card box that's decorated with mopa. I meant to bring it tonight, I forgot to bring it, but looks very much like this. And again, looks like paint from a distance, not paint. It's this resin, which was cut into little pieces and pressed in place very carefully to make decorations like this. As early as the second half of the 16th century, the Spanish saw this resin being used in the Pasto region by local craftspeople. They didn't understand where it came from or how it was processed, but they apparently enlisted skilled native craftsmen to begin making wooden objects decorated with mopa for export to Europe, and these became very popular for a period of time. This is one of the most complex ones, the surviving ones, and this is in the Hispanic Society of America collection. It's a portable writing desk. It's probably about as wide as this podium is, just a box-like thing. You could open it up and it has little compartments for storing different things, and the entire exterior surface of it is decorated with mopa decorations. This is a close-up of the surface of that object. Common to the decoration of many of the colonial objects made in Pasto are three-layer sandwiches. They would take a thicker layer of the resin that didn't have any added colors. Then they would stick a piece of silver leaf onto that resin, and then they would stick a very thin, tinted, transparent upper layer of resin on top of the silver. So they have these little sandwiches. They then cut them into little pieces, and those are the ones they stuck on the surface of the object to decorate them. The ones with the silver leaf underneath, the silver leaf gives is a reflective surface that light goes through and shines back through the tinted glaze, so the mopa acts as a kind of a tinted glaze. And they use natural dyes, including indigo, to tint the mopa, so these very thin upper layers were transparent. And we now move about 1,000 miles south to the homeland in the Inca Empire, which was centered around present-day Cusco in Peru. Besides the craft people in Colombia, the Inca were the only other culture known to have used mopa resin. It's generally assumed that the Inca learned about the resin from the native people in Colombia rather than independently discovering it and learning how to process and use it, since it was such an unusual material. The Inca used the resin to decorate wooden carol cups. Carol cups, made in pairs usually, were used to serve chicha, which is a beverage made from maize, in ceremonies that had long played an important role in Incan and Andean culture. And in fact, carols are still used by native peoples in the Andes. The Inca used mostly opaque layers of mopa that were thicker than the ones used in Colombia, and they inlaid these into shallow carved recesses on with their wooden carol cups. The earliest wooden carol cups we know from the Inca contain only shallow carved geometric decorations and no colored mopa inlays. At the moment, the earliest dated cups with mopa decorations, such as this one, come from about the time of contact with the Spanish in the 1530s. Later in the colonial period, carol cups such as this one came to contain more elaborate decorations that cover most of the surface. The making of these types of carols ended about 1800 with the end of the colonial period. This is a close-up of the surface of one of the carol cups. It shows the wooden surface, and then there were these shallow carved recesses, and then the resin was pushed into these recesses so it's at about the same level as the surrounding wood. And you can certainly put one layer of mopa on top of another one, and that's how the little white decorations were done on the red at the lower right and above too. We need to know exactly what. Whoops! I skipped a slide. Whoops! No, I didn't skip a slide. I probably went. Okay. This is just to show the from a nice National Geographic article, an old one on the Inca Empire and the extent of it. And the Incas were an empire-building people, and the original small empire around Cusco grew and grew and grew, and eventually reached the southern Colombia border, as far as we know, in the 1520s or the 1530s. That's according to our current knowledge. So if the Inca actually learned about this resin from the craftspeople, the native people in Colombia, it would seem that they could not have done so until that very late period, just before the Spanish arrived in, say, the 1520s or the early 1530s. Our scientific research project began by attempting to characterize the resin from the only two species of Eleasia trees that produce copious amounts of resin. And we got a number of samples from botanical collections of resin from these two types of trees. And we were attempting to, first of all, determine the species of resin that was used by the two different cultures, the one used by the Inca and the one used by the craftspeople in Colombia. We developed our analytical project by first considering the basic pathway by which these resins are created in plants, such as the Eleasia trees. There are two parallel pathways, it turns out, that lead to the resin. The one on the left produces the resin itself, and it's the same pathway by which phenylalanine, one of those essential amino acids that only come from plants, is also created. Cinnamic acid, a little molecule shown at the lower left in that image, is a precursor of the rubbery polymeric molecules that make up the resin itself. Then the right pathway, a totally separate pathway, produces as end products compounds called flavonoids, and flavonoids are yellow-colored compounds. They're created by many, many, many plants, just a couple thousand different ones known, and they've long been used, various plants to supply yellow dyestuffs for dyeing purposes, or also for making lake pigments. And because of these parallel pathways, mopa resin can be expected to contain not only the rubbery resin, but also traces of these yellow compounds. This is a graph. You don't have to pay attention to exactly what this is showing. But by analyzing the botanical specimens, we found that the ratio of two cinnamic acid derivatives, which are components of the resin, these ratios were different between the two species. And the two species are pastolensis and utilis. Pastolensis was actually named after the town of Pasto in Colombia because a Colombian botanist discovered the resin, first discovered there was a separate species in the 1970s. Up till then, everybody thought it was utilis, the other one. But we can tell the difference between pastolensis and utilis, and when we actually analyzed some samples from objects from Pasto, including that box I showed you a little while ago, and some samples from Carol's, we discovered that the objects from Pasto look like they were made with pastolensis resin, which is the type of species that the current craftspeople in Pasto, Colombia also use, because you can go to the market in Colombia and purchase hunks of the resin, and we've done that, or some of my collaborators have, and brought it back, and it is from the pastolensis species. On the other hand, the Carol's would seem to have been made from the other resin, the other species, the resin utilis. We did a whole second set of analyses to focus on the flavonoids, those yellow compounds that we thought were in the resin, and indeed they were in the resin. And I just show an example of a reference pastolensis and a reference utilis extract with their flavonoids. And again, no need to understand what each of these is, but the profile is different in the pastolensis and utilis. And we observed the same thing in samples from the objects from Pasto and the Incan Caros, namely that the profile of flavonoids from utilis was what we found in the Caros, and the profile from pastolensis is what we found in the objects made in Pasto. So we had two independent techniques, both of which suggested that the Incas were not using the same species of tree as the craftsmen in Colombia were. This suggested to us that the Inca probably discovered the use of the resin independently from the people in Pasto, because the story went that if they found out about this resin when they reached Pasto towards the end of their empire days, that they would have brought craftsmen back and probably the resin from that area, and the craftsmen would have been used to then make carols, decorate their carols, as they did similar things with other types of craftsmen and other types of people throughout their empire, the history of their empire. But if that were the case, you would think that they would bring back the resin. The same resin was being used in Pasto, but that was not the same resin that was being used in Pasto. That's a conclusion that many archaeologists aren't ready to accept yet, and it does warrant further research. And we are at the moment still doing additional research with various archaeologists and art historians and some botanists and some conservators on additional studies which maybe can help resolve this question of the origin of the resin. This is a timeline of what we presently understand about the use of the resin by the two cultures. The more or less continuous use in Colombia for nearly a millennia, possibly longer, and the use of the resin by the Inca over only a 300-year period. And that is my last bit of story, and I am happy to answer any questions on any of these stories, or for that matter, any other question you might have on Science and Art Museum. I might be able to answer some of those too. I just wanted to give you a flavor of the kinds of projects that we're doing in our lab, but different kinds of projects and all types of materials are done in all these other labs throughout the U.S. and many in all parts of the world. Thank you.